Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is time for my review of the new debut album from LAXX. This one is called Fake Friends. Before I dive into today's review, I think it would be wise to mention that my throat is feeling a little bit under the weather, so I'm going to try to not strain it as much as possible. And I probably would have just pushed back doing reviews for a few more days, but I really did want to talk about this new LAXX album. LAXX is a British hybrid trap DJ and producer who I've been following for a few years now. Following the explosion of trap and electronic music that came with Bauer's Harlem Shake in 2012, I had a really hard time getting into the genre. That is until LAXX came on the scene and graced our ears with songs like Step 1 and Step 2. Step 2 being the song that I'd say really turned me over. The kind of wacky, squealing, high-pitched production on that song is something that really caught my ear. And moving forward, it was very evident that LAXX had a very distinct production style that I could really get down with. A certain brand, per se, that really made him stand out from other hybrid trap producers and made him fit in very nicely with the lineup on Never Say Die Records. Although, looking back on it, he's really been chasing after this particular brand, this particular sound for so many years now that I can see how I've kind of lost interest in LAXX just a little bit. And that's not really to say that I've absolutely hated any of the EPs or singles he's put out recently. It's just that more or less his music seems to kind of blend together a bit, and I have a really hard time distinguishing which songs I really like from other ones. One thing that I have noticed over time with LAXX's music is that it seems to continually get a bit more glitchy, a little bit more experimental, more distorted. So I guess when LAXX announced that he had a debut album coming, I really had no idea what I was supposed to expect. But since LAXX was a name that was so influential to my taste in bass music, I was pretty excited either way. Furthermore, the promotional campaign for Fake Friends got me even more excited. I don't know if you guys caught any of what was going on in regards to this album's promotion, but this was easily one of my favorite album campaigns of all time. The whole thing was essentially a satire on how EDM artists tend to promote their own albums, kind of launching everything in different phases, dropping various singles, creating a bunch of hype for the album. LAXX even acted a bit like a bot himself, responding to fans' tweets with automated response, fire emoji, fire emoji, fire emoji. If you haven't checked any of that out, I would strongly suggest you give a scroll through LAXX's Twitter. It's just hilarious. As more and more time passed with the Fake Friends campaign, I can say that I got increasingly excited about how it was going to turn out. And when the album finally dropped, I cannot say I was disappointed. I think one of the main reasons I enjoyed this album so much is because it tends to stray away from a lot of the cliches that I've seen in bass music LPs in the last couple years. For one, it doesn't have a ton of guest producers coming in to make appearances and kind of add their own flair to the album. This album is primarily LAXX bringing on his own unique brand of production, but at the same time, it also doesn't see LAXX continually sticking to that same style that made me kind of lose interest in him over the last couple years. For the most part, I think LAXX sticks to production and sound design that he feels very comfortable mixing, but also feels free to kind of experiment in different styles. So he's able to try out genres like bass house or brostep without sounding too awkward or out of place. In fact, this album reminds me a lot of Barely Alive's debut album, not because they sound super similar, but more or less just because LAXX feels like he can try out all these different kind of ideas while comfortably kind of remaining in his own little coop of sound design. We Are Barely Alive was another album that I honestly enjoyed quite a bit, and I think a big part of what played into that is that they really didn't feel like they needed to have a ton of guest vocalists and producers to come feature on it. LAXX does practically the same thing here. There are only 5 collaborators on this album, and 4 of those are vocals. The only co-production is by Dion Timmer on the track Join Me. Given that LAXX has worked with such a wide array of EDM producers in the past, primarily on the Never Say Die label, I was thinking hell yeah to the fact that Dion Timmer is the only co-producer on this entire album, as he is one of my favorite up-and-comers in the bass music world. Join Me is just absolutely killer too. It's probably the single on this album that got me the most stoked for it. It's got this really unique build-up going into the first drop that almost sounds like it could be a drop itself. It uses this really interesting sound that sounds like it could have been sampled from like a wind-up kid's toy or something. And then they smack us hard with this absolutely monumental festival trap drop, and then we get a pretty decent little bro step drop toward the end of the track as well that I enjoyed quite a bit. But that's definitely not the only bit of production that I found myself really enjoying on this album. In fact, I really have very little problems with it. I will say the song New Me was a little bit underwhelming my first run through this album. I really do enjoy the section that's a bit more hip-hoppy and has a little bit more minimal LAXX elements kind of sitting in the back, but then I thought the drop was pretty underwhelming, although I will say I have gotten used to it running through the album a few more times. And then the other one I was a little bit confused about in the track list was actually the title track, Fake Friends, which takes on that bass house sound. Being that Fake Friends is the only house cut on the album, I do think it sits a little bit awkwardly in the track list, but I think it does have its purpose as well. It for one, just varies things up a little bit, but then for two, with this song being the title track, I do think it kind of harkens back to LAXX's campaign with this album. Bass house still is a little bit of a trendy sound, even if it's less trendy than it was maybe a year or two ago. Being that LAXX isn't a house producer himself, I do think it's pretty funny how he was kind of able to latch on to the exact like trope of a bass house song so easily. It sounds like it could have been produced by Chami. And although Fake Friends is the only straight house track on this album, there are some other songs that do take some really nice influences from house music. Turn the Clocks Back is one that does that, and in a really interesting way, with a really deep, heavy club bass line, but then it uses more of a dubstep kind of beat. Let 'Em Know is one that does something kind of similar, although in a little bit more of a glitchy and distorted kind of way. Needless to say, I really like the approach to those two tracks a lot, although like I was saying before, I really don't have a lot of problems with this album. It's just kind of banger after banger. I thought Disconnect, the album's intro, was a little bit pointless just because it tends to focus its time previewing what's going to come on the album's second track, High From It, but then the intro just kind of cuts off right at the end. Although I really don't have a ton of complaints when it comes to High From It. It has some really kind of classic trappy vocal chops in the first drop that kind of pair with this really hard hitting kick drum. But then the second drop on High From It is even more rewarding. It's absolutely monumental and reminds me a little bit more of LAXX's kind of classic sound. It probably reminds me the most of his single Hardcore. The track Fiends is one that's a little bit more reminiscent of LAXX in its synth work. Its drop sounds more like something out of the UK's early dubstep scene. The track Feels So Good was another one of my personal standouts. It almost has like this really danceable melody to it, but one of the standout things in this track, in my opinion, is just this really heavy, distorted bass line that happens during the drop that I honestly wish came out a little bit more in the mix, because if you can hear this kind of sitting in the background, it's just nuts. The song Signals is by far one of the most trap-leaning productions on the album. Its rhythm and beat are definitely super trappy, and the lead sound in the drop almost sounds like it could be a literal siren. The song also uses stringed instruments pretty heavily, really giving it kind of a cinematic feel. Heart, featuring the up-and-comer Gigi Magri, is one that I didn't originally love a ton when it was a single, but given that it's such a different production than the rest of this album, I don't mind it at all in the album's track list. Ice Cold is obviously the one out of the two more hip-hop leaning tracks on this album that I prefer, although not necessarily for the vocals from Just. I think probably the track's best feature is just its absolutely huge, impactful lead synth that's used in the drop, which is like a punch to the gut with these huge rising stabs. The album ends in kind of an interesting way on the song I Need You, which is really LAXX's own take on the brostep genre. His approach to the genre is really heavy, but I'd also say it's pretty unique, and I personally enjoyed the song a lot. And then of course, as the song should, being that it is the album's outro, does tone things back a little bit toward the end of the track with some softer elements, some little light vocal chops and strings. In the end, I don't think this album is absolute perfection for my taste, but being that it's LAXX's debut album, he really did surprise me in a lot of places, and really I think he did about as good as he could have with this. Most of the productions on this album didn't absolutely blow my mind, although there were some really solid moments in that department. I also will say that I genuinely enjoyed the content on this album more than what LAXX has given us in his singles, maybe his EPs in the past too. But like I said, LAXX really did everything he needed to with this album. He didn't overload it with a ton of guest features and co-producers, and he just made an album of straight bangers that work and is still pretty diverse in its sound, while at the same time he doesn't vary things up so much that fans of his older work are going to feel completely disconnected from it. And really, Fake Friends is just about a perfect model of what a debut album should look like for an EDM artist. Producers, take note. For Fake Friends, I am feeling a light 7.5 out of 10. If you guys haven't checked out this album yet, make sure to do it, especially if you're a bass music fan. I have the Spotify link down in the description for you if you want to go check it out for yourself. And if you have listened to this album, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes. I hope you guys enjoyed this this review where my voice really isn't up to where it should be, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace.